Trump's unfiltered late-night Rose Garden remarks exposed his frustration, anger, and inability to control the mounting pressure against him, and what unfolded was not just a speech but a revealing display of a leader cornered by events, surrounded by controversies, and consumed by his own rhetoric. From the very first moment he stepped into the Rose Garden, the atmosphere was unlike any presidential address in recent memory. The late-night timing itself felt unusual, creating a sense of urgency and unpredictability that immediately put viewers on edge. His voice carried not the steady authority expected from a commander-in-chief but a sharp, uneven tone filled with irritation, signaling from the outset that this was not going to be a moment of reassurance. His words were rapid, scattered, and forceful, each one carrying the weight of a man desperate to project strength while simultaneously betraying weakness through his demeanor. The frustration he displayed was palpable, a kind of simmering anger that could not be contained. As he lashed out at critics, opponents, and even perceived allies, it became clear that this was more than political theater, it was a glimpse into the inner turmoil of a man under immense stress. His body language told its own story, with abrupt hand gestures, narrowed eyes, and restless pacing that mirrored the chaos in his words. This lack of composure undermined any attempt at control, making the speech less about leadership and more about venting. For many watching, it became impossible to ignore how unhinged the presentation felt, as if the traditional boundaries of presidential communication had collapsed in real time. The anger, too, was not just directed outward but seemed to consume him from within. Each sentence he delivered was heavy with accusation, blame, and defensiveness, showing a president more concerned with protecting his image than addressing the real challenges at hand. He repeatedly circled back to old grievances, rehashing past slights and relitigating battles long decided in the public arena. This fixation on personal vendettas rather than substantive solutions revealed how deeply his frustrations had taken root. Rather than using the platform to inspire, calm, or unify, the moment became a reflection of his inability to rise above conflict, trapping him in an endless loop of anger and deflection. The inability to control the mounting pressure surrounding him was evident at every turn. Reporters noted how the questions he faced only seemed to intensify his agitation, as if each inquiry was a direct assault on his credibility. Instead of measured responses, he offered sharp retorts, exaggerated claims, and outright dismissals, escalating tensions instead of diffusing them. This combative approach might have been intended to showcase defiance, but instead it exposed just how fragile his position had become. The mounting investigations, the ongoing legal troubles, and the relentless criticism from both political opponents and segments of the media were visibly weighing on him, and the Rose Garden meltdown became the most public manifestation of that strain. The symbolism of the Rose Garden itself made the meltdown even more striking. Traditionally a place associated with major announcements, historic ceremonies, and dignified addresses, it was transformed into a stage for venting frustration. The contrast was stark and jarring, underscoring the depth of his unraveling. Where other presidents had stood with composure and gravitas, Trump's late-night performance shattered expectations and raised questions about his capacity to maintain control in moments of crisis. The setting amplified the sense of disorder, as if even the most iconic spaces of presidential power could not shield him from the chaos he carried with him. Observers quickly noted how the speech reflected not just his personal struggles but also the larger political environment he has created. The language of attack, the disdain for opponents, and the constant insistence on loyalty revealed a leader entrenched in a siege mentality. This late-night outburst was not an isolated incident but the culmination of years of escalating rhetoric, where anger and confrontation became the default mode of communication. The meltdown, therefore, was both personal and systemic, a product of Trump's own temperament as well as the broader culture of division he has fostered. As the minutes dragged on, the speech grew increasingly erratic, moving from one grievance to another without coherence or structure. This unfiltered style, once celebrated by supporters as refreshing authenticity, now seemed reckless and unstable. Each new outburst added to the impression of a man unraveling before the cameras, unable to sustain the image of control he so desperately wanted to project. Viewers watching live described feeling both riveted and alarmed, as if they were witnessing history not through carefully crafted policy announcements but through the raw spectacle of a president unable to manage his own emotions. The fallout from this display was immediate. Commentators across the political spectrum analyzed the performance as a sign of weakness rather than strength. His visible frustration suggested that the pressure of ongoing scrutiny was finally breaking through the facade he tried to maintain. Even some of his staunchest defenders found it difficult to spin the meltdown as anything other than damaging, with the optics of anger and disarray overshadowing any intended message. The late-night timing, rather than giving him an edge, only amplified the sense of desperation, as if he had chosen the cover of darkness to vent feelings he could no longer contain during the day. What made this moment particularly revealing was not simply the content of his words but the way they were delivered. Leadership in moments of crisis is often judged less by policy detail and more by tone, composure, and presence. Trump's inability to demonstrate these qualities in the Rose Garden suggested that the mounting pressure had eroded his ability to perform even the basic expectations of presidential communication. The nation did not see calm reassurance but rather explosive frustration, and that image is likely to linger far longer than the specific lines he delivered. In expanding on this keynote, the late-night Rose Garden meltdown serves as a vivid reminder of how much pressure has accumulated around Trump and how poorly he is managing it. The frustration, anger, and lack of control that defined his remarks are not just isolated traits but part of a broader narrative of a leader struggling to contain forces closing in on him. The performance underscored the fragility of his public persona, showing that beneath the bravado lies a deep vulnerability that surfaces when the spotlight grows too intense. His unfiltered outburst may have been intended as a show of dominance, but in reality, it revealed the exact opposite. A president weighed down by his own words, his own anger, and his own inability to master the moment. The meltdown highlighted his spiraling state of mind, turning a place of presidential authority into a stage of chaos. And it was clear from the very beginning that the weight of his emotions overshadowed any attempt at presenting a structured or composed message. The Rose Garden has historically been a symbol of calm leadership, a setting where presidents have delivered solemn announcements or celebrated moments of unity. Yet on this late night, it was transformed into a backdrop for confusion and disorder, where every word and gesture revealed more about his inner turmoil than any intended political strategy. The tone of his delivery was uneven, swinging between loud bursts of indignation and quieter, muttering accusations that betrayed just how destabilized his state of mind had become. Instead of confidence, viewers witnessed volatility, and instead of stability, they saw a leader struggling to hold himself together under the harsh spotlight of public scrutiny. The spiral was not subtle. His language shifted erratically, jumping from one grievance to another without logic or connection, leaving listeners uncertain about the purpose of the address. At times, he revisited old battles, dredging up names and accusations from years past, as though haunted by them even now. At other moments, he turned to conspiracy-like claims, weaving narratives that seemed more like improvisation than prepared statements. This lack of cohesion amplified the impression that his thoughts were unraveling in real time, turning what should have been a moment of clarity into a spectacle of disarray. The disorder in his speech reflected the disorder within, a mirror of a spiraling state of mind that could no longer be disguised through the usual theatrics of political performance. The setting only intensified the contrast. The Rose Garden is etched into the public consciousness as a place of ceremony, authority, and dignity, where a leader embodies the role of the presidency. Yet on this night, it looked and felt entirely different, as though the grandeur of the setting had been diminished by the chaos of his demeanor. The carefully maintained hedges and flowers seemed almost out of place behind a figure so visibly unsettled. Instead of amplifying presidential power, the setting highlighted the disconnect between expectation and reality. The spiraling emotions on display clashed with the historic weight of the location, creating a surreal scene that underscored how far the moment had strayed from tradition. Observers noted how his body language betrayed the inner chaos even more than his words. He shifted from gesturing wildly with his hands to leaning heavily on the podium, as if grasping for stability. His eyes darted frequently, scanning the crowd as though searching for both approval and threats, a reflection of his uneasy mental state. He interrupted himself repeatedly, losing track of his sentences or abandoning them halfway through, only to replace them with yet another grievance. These physical signs of agitation reinforced the sense that the speech was not merely a political misstep but a window into a man unraveling before the cameras. The spiral was not hidden, it was visible, audible, and undeniable. The chaos of the scene was magnified by his interactions with reporters. Questions that should have been routine seemed to provoke outsized reactions, with his answers escalating from defensive to combative in a matter of seconds. His tone carried an edge that was sharper than usual, less a performance of strength than an outburst of exasperation. Each question seemed to chip away at his patience, driving him further into a state of visible agitation. In these exchanges, the stage of chaos expanded beyond his prepared remarks, spilling into every corner of the encounter and leaving behind a trail of hostility rather than leadership. This breakdown of composure also reflected the immense pressure bearing down on him. Legal challenges, political rivalries, and constant public criticism had created a storm that was impossible to ignore, and in the Rose Garden meltdown, it seemed as though that storm had broken through whatever defenses he had left. His inability to stay focused, his reliance on grievance-laden narratives, and his visibly shaken demeanor all pointed toward a leader unable to manage the weight of the moment. The spiral was not just a personal struggle but a political reality, revealing cracks in the image of control he had spent years trying to maintain. The symbolism of the meltdown extended far beyond the immediate event. For many viewers, it was a stark illustration of what happens when authority is consumed by chaos. The office of the presidency carries expectations of steadiness and resilience, yet this display offered neither. Instead, it presented volatility, impulsiveness, and instability, characteristics that erode the very foundation of authority. The Rose Garden, once a setting of reassurance, was transformed into an emblem of disorder, its meaning reshaped by the actions of the man standing at the podium. The imagery was powerful, as if chaos itself had taken the place of governance, and the setting was powerless to contain it. Throughout the speech, the lack of coherence and the visible agitation combined to create an atmosphere that unsettled both supporters and critics alike. Those who might have hoped for a strong defense of his actions or a confident presentation of his plans were left instead with confusion and concern. His spiral undermined the very message he might have hoped to deliver, replacing clarity with contradiction and strength with instability. The stage of chaos became not just a description of the moment but the defining feature of the address, something that no amount of post-speech spin could erase. What made the meltdown so striking was how it exposed vulnerability in real time. Political leaders often rely on scripted remarks to maintain an aura of control, but in this unscripted, unfiltered outburst, the mask slipped. The spiraling state of mind that many had speculated about was suddenly on full display, unshielded by carefully chosen words or managed appearances. It was raw, unpolished, and deeply revealing, showing not just what he wanted the public to believe but what he could no longer hide. The chaos on stage mirrored the chaos within, creating a moment that felt both historic and alarming in equal measure. As the address stretched on, the disorder only deepened, with each new outburst compounding the impression of a leader unraveling under pressure. The absence of clear goals, the fixation on grievances, and the constant shifts in tone created a pattern that was unmistakable. The Rose Garden meltdown highlighted not a momentary lapse but a spiraling trend, one that suggested the pressures surrounding him were too great to contain. The symbolism of authority had been overshadowed by the reality of chaos, and the speech became less about political messaging and more about the spectacle of a president caught in his own storm. This explosive outburst revealed deeper cracks in his leadership, raising questions about stability, accountability, and the future of his political influence. And in that late-night Rose Garden appearance, the unraveling was not just a matter of tone but a broader indication of the weaknesses that have long been simmering beneath the surface. The meltdown served as a magnifying glass, enlarging every flaw that critics had pointed to for years while also exposing vulnerabilities that even his supporters found difficult to ignore. Leadership, in its truest sense, demands the ability to rise above personal grievances, to display calm in times of turbulence, and to project clarity when the nation is surrounded by uncertainty. What unfolded in that chaotic scene was the opposite, a leader consumed by his own frustrations, unable to distance personal battles from the responsibilities of the office, and incapable of sustaining the image of control he had long tried to project. The cracks in leadership became evident not only through his words but through the very structure of the speech. Instead of presenting coherent arguments or clear policies, the late-night address was riddled with rants, personal attacks, and grievances that seemed to overwhelm any attempt at statesmanship. These moments highlighted how fragile his approach to leadership had become, built less on stability and more on constant conflict. Each accusation he hurled, each deflection he attempted, and each dramatic pause to emphasize victimhood pointed not toward authority but toward fragility. This fragility was not hidden behind polished remarks or a managed setting, it was laid bare in the most public of ways, raising doubts about his capacity to govern effectively under mounting pressure. The issue of stability loomed large throughout the entire display. Stability is the cornerstone of leadership, the quality that reassures both allies and adversaries that the person in charge is steady, resilient, and dependable. Yet on this night, the absence of stability was the most defining characteristic of his demeanor. His voice cracked with frustration, his pacing grew more erratic as the minutes passed, and his responses to questions bordered on volatile. These signs collectively suggested not just a temporary outburst but a deeper instability that undermines confidence in his ability to withstand challenges. For those watching closely, the message was clear: this was not a leader grounded in calm authority but one spiraling under the pressures of accountability. Accountability, too, hovered over the scene like a shadow he could not escape. The anger he directed outward often felt like an attempt to deflect attention from the legal, political, and moral questions that continue to surround him. By targeting critics, journalists, and political opponents, he sought to shift the narrative, but in doing so, he inadvertently underscored the very issues he hoped to bury. The outburst revealed a leader unable to confront accountability head-on, choosing instead to lash out in ways that only deepened doubts about his judgment. True accountability requires a willingness to accept responsibility, yet his meltdown revealed an instinct to evade and attack, a sign of leadership under strain rather than leadership with vision. The future of his political influence was perhaps the most significant question raised by this spectacle. For years, his base had admired his unfiltered style, interpreting it as authenticity rather than instability. But as the Rose Garden outburst unfolded, the line between authenticity and chaos blurred in ways that risk alienating even those who once celebrated his bluntness. Political influence relies on the perception of strength, control, and the ability to guide others through uncertainty. Yet the meltdown painted a picture of weakness and disorder, a portrayal that could chip away at the foundation of his support. If leadership is measured by the ability to inspire confidence, the chaotic performance cast serious doubt on whether he could continue to wield the same level of political sway moving forward. Observers pointed out that the cracks on display were not sudden developments but the culmination of patterns long evident in his leadership style. The reliance on personal attacks, the tendency to deflect blame, and the inability to separate personal grievances from national responsibilities had always been part of his approach. But in the heightened atmosphere of a late-night Rose Garden address, those patterns became impossible to ignore or excuse. The spectacle magnified them, turning long-standing critiques into undeniable realities. What may have once been dismissed as strategy or personality quirks now appeared as liabilities, with serious implications for both governance and political viability. The moment also drew attention to the broader perception of presidential authority. Historically, presidents have used the Rose Garden as a stage to strengthen their leadership image, projecting stability and authority during times of crisis. Instead, this episode inverted that symbolism, with the setting serving as a stark contrast to the disorder unfolding at the podium. The dissonance between place and performance highlighted just how fractured his leadership had become. Rather than reinforcing authority, the moment dismantled it, leaving behind an image of chaos in one of the most symbolic spaces of American governance. The deeper cracks revealed by the outburst also raised pressing questions about decision-making under pressure. If a leader is visibly destabilized during a public address, what does that suggest about their ability to navigate private, high-stakes decisions that carry national or global consequences. The instability witnessed in the Rose Garden raised alarms about the ripple effects of such leadership in moments of real crisis, where calm calculation is essential. The public unraveling suggested that the same volatility could permeate behind closed doors, further eroding confidence in his capacity to lead effectively. The spiral also exposed the isolation of his leadership. Surrounded by critics and weighed down by investigations, the Rose Garden outburst felt less like a speech to the nation and more like a personal monologue directed at imagined enemies. This sense of isolation, where allies are few and every voice is perceived as opposition, is itself a crack in leadership. Leaders thrive on coalition building, on inspiring others to follow their vision, but in this moment, what emerged was an image of a man standing alone, consumed by grievances, and increasingly detached from the broader responsibilities of office. The chaos of the scene also invited broader reflection on the role of temperament in leadership. Policies and strategies matter, but so does demeanor, the ability to communicate steadiness in times of turmoil. The explosive outburst showed a temperament that was combustible rather than measured, reactive rather than deliberate. Such traits, on display in such a symbolic setting, underscored the fragility of his leadership and raised doubts about whether his influence could withstand the pressures ahead. For those watching, the cracks were not subtle. They were glaring, unavoidable, and telling of a leader whose control was slipping in real time. The late-night Rose Garden meltdown will be remembered not only for its immediate drama but for the way it peeled back the layers of leadership to expose what lay beneath. The cracks in stability, the evasion of accountability, and the looming questions about his political future all converged in one chaotic moment, leaving behind an indelible impression of fragility rather than authority.